Have you ever been told with a polished smile and a slideshow full of buzzwords that your lifetime of experience is now a problem? It happened to me in a glass-walled conference room 3 floors above the very machines I helped design. 31 years of loyalty, and suddenly I was labeled resistant to innovation, not because I failed, but because I knew too much about how things actually worked. My name is Arturo Medina. For over 3 decades, I served as the lead systems architect at Neuroforge AI, a company that builds industrial automation powered by artificial intelligence. I helped lay the foundations before the world even understood what neural networks could do. But that day, I wasn't a founder anymore. I was legacy. Lucia Carranza, the new VP of Innovation, never looked me in the eye when she let me go. She said my mindset didn't align with their cloud-native future. I said very little, I smiled, and I walked away. But some systems only run because someone like me stayed up at 3 a.m. to fix them. And when those systems break, someone will have to answer for it. If you've ever felt discarded or underestimated, this story is for you. And if it resonates with you, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that bring justice where it's due. I still remember the temperature of that room, too cold for comfort, too calculated to be accidental. A massive display screen behind Lucia Carranza beamed with her presentation title, Strategic Repositioning for Scalable Innovation, as if buzzwords could make betrayal easier to swallow. Lucia sat at the head of the conference table, flanked by 2 consultants from Zynocore. One of them kept tapping away on a tablet, the other pretended to nod with interest every time she spoke. I didn't belong in this room anymore, not because I was incapable, but because I had become inconvenient. She clicked to the next slide, a pie chart labeled Talent Reallocation. And just like that, my 31 years of work were reduced to a sliver of outdated resource planning. The future of Neuroforge relies on a workforce aligned with the pace of machine learning advancement, Lucia said without looking at me. That means restructuring certain roles to optimize forward-thinking capacity. I stayed silent. I'd learned long ago that silence can make a bigger impact than protest. But inside, a quiet fire began to build. I had trained 3 of the engineers who were now tasked with replacing my systems. I'd written code that still held together the warehouse robots, the vision recognition models, the safety interruption mechanisms that had prevented over 100 accidents. These weren't just lines of code, they were lifelines. And yet none of it mattered now. At least not to them. Lucia spoke as if I were already gone. We're excited to begin migration to Zynocore's cloud-native platform. It will help unify our AI stack and eliminate the legacy friction we've been tolerating. She used the word friction like a stain she couldn't scrub out. I was the friction. Do you have any questions, Arturo? She finally asked, as if this were a discussion. I met her eyes for the first time that morning. No, I said. It's clear you've made your decision. Good, she replied too quickly. Of course, we'd appreciate your cooperation with documentation. A proper handover. I nodded. I'll make sure everything officially deployed is properly documented. The distinction in my wording didn't register with her. She had no idea what she'd just walked past, and I wasn't about to enlighten her. I left the meeting with a neutral expression, offering nods to colleagues in the hallway, some too busy to notice, some too cautious to ask. I passed the security desk, glanced briefly at the server room I had practically lived in for years, and kept walking. No drama, no farewell party. Just the closing of a chapter by someone who never read the book. But as I stepped outside into the warm air of that November morning, I knew something they didn't. They had just unplugged the one person who knew where the real wires were buried. And those wires, they weren't in the manuals. They were in my head. They wanted a future without me. What they didn't realize was how much of their future still depended on my past. I joined Neuroforge AI in 1993, long before it became the name on smart helmets and industrial think tank panels. Back then, it wasn't even called Neuroforge. It was Vector Systems, a cramped startup run out of a converted machine shop on the outskirts of Monterey. 6 of us shared one space heater and a dream to bring intelligent automation to Mexico's manufacturing sector. I was 30, recently laid off from an automation contractor that went under during the peso crash. My wife Ava was pregnant with our second child. I needed stability. What I found instead was potential. The founder, Don Agustin Reyes, didn't care about degrees or fancy resumes. He wanted people who could build. And I could build. My first task, write a neural link interface to let robotic arms respond to adaptive pressure thresholds. I worked 16-hour days for 3 months straight, drinking instant coffee and debugging in the dark. By the time it launched, the system reduced breakage rates in a glass plant by 27%. They gave me a desk after that, well, technically a tool bench cleared out in the corner of the electrical room. But it was mine. Over the next 3 decades, I built everything they ran on. I designed the first-generation process control matrix, the one that let human operators collaborate with AI-driven inspection cameras in real time. When we expanded into automotive manufacturing, I built the predictive calibration module that kept assembly tolerances within 2 microns across 10 plants. I didn't just write code, I built the nervous system. When an earthquake disrupted power in 2007, it was my emergency script that rerouted backup power to the robotic control centers without frying the internal boards. When a cyber attack nearly crippled our data center in 2015, I stayed 38 hours straight, patching vulnerabilities 1 line at a time. There was no documentation, no handoff, no outside help. Just me. Eva used to joke that the only thing I babied more than our children were the servers. She wasn't entirely wrong. While she planted roses in the backyard and scolded the neighborhood cats for digging in her tomatoes, I tweaked latency buffers and obsessively optimized my data schemas. But she understood. She saw what others didn't, that my work wasn't just technical, it was personal. It fed families. It protected workers. It kept factories humming and paychecks printing. Then 3 years ago, cancer took her. It started as a shadow on a scan and ended with me sitting alone in a quiet hospital room, holding her hand as machines beeped slower and slower. After that, work became my anchor. My daughter Elena had moved to Spain by then, researching AI ethics at the University of Salamanca. My son Tomas was working in logistics in Puebla. The servers, the systems, the code, those were my constants. Predictable, containable, fixable. When Don Agustin retired and sold the company to a global consortium, I stayed. I had promised him I'd see the mission through. He once told me, "Arturo, if these machines ever learn to think, I want them to think with integrity. Like you." But with his departure came executives like Lucia Carranza, slick, efficient, and utterly detached from the soul of the company. She had never been inside a factory line when sparks fly and coolant stings your nose. She had never seen a worker cry with relief because our automation system caught a fault that could have shattered his wrist. To her, our legacy systems were a burden. To me, they were sacred. That's the thing about old systems, they don't break because they're outdated. They break because someone who doesn't understand them tries to replace them. And no one, not Lucia, not her consultants, not her cloud dashboards, had the faintest idea what they were actually built on. They saw code. I saw commitment. They saw friction. I saw fingerprints. And once they erased me, they also erased the only person who knew how to keep it all breathing. Lucia Carranza arrived at Neuroforge like a gust of sterile air, cold, sharp, and heavily perfumed with corporate ambition. She wasn't rude. In fact, she was always polite. But her politeness had the same effect as a screensaver, smooth blank, and ultimately uninterested in anything deeper than the surface. She had just returned from Silicon Valley, where she'd spent 5 years bouncing between innovation labs and venture-backed AI startups. According to her LinkedIn profile, she specialized in disruptive modernization for legacy-dense industries. Her language was always like that, clinical, high gloss, and hollow. Her first move was a department-wide audit. She brought in a group of consultants from a firm called Deceit, dressed like they'd stepped out of a tech conference catalog, slim suits, tablet holsters, and endless acronyms. They conducted interviews, gathered pain points, and drew bubble diagrams no one in the trenches could interpret. They never came to the basement. No one ever came to the basement. That's where our real infrastructure lived, old hardware breathing in a carefully cooled humtangles of server racks pulsing with processes I had built line by line. The consultants didn't ask me anything. Lucia said they were prioritizing the user journey. That meant people who interacted with dashboards, not the people who kept them running. Within 2 months, she had drafted a transition plan titled Project Horizon. It was supposed to consolidate all factory and enterprise operations into a new cloud-based AI stack called Zynocore. The brochure was impressive, sleek charts, promises of 50% faster deployment, and AI modules that learned autonomously. On paper, it looked perfect. In reality, it was designed for startups, not companies with 3 decades of specialized operations. I submitted a 17-page report outlining key concerns, undocumented dependencies, non-standard API bridges, fragile modules that couldn't be ported without refactoring. No one replied. A week later, the company hosted an all-hands meeting with pizza and branded mugs celebrating the new era of Neuroforge. Lucia took the stage in front of the warehouse crew and announced the upcoming migration with a confident smile. Behind her, slides showed words like agile, scalable, cloud-native, future-proof. No one clapped, not even the interns. The younger engineers, the ones I had trained, started receiving invites to closed-door planning sessions. They were polite to me in the hallway, but hesitant, like they didn't want to be seen too close. I didn't blame them. You don't survive in modern tech by being loyal. You survive by being seen as adaptable. That was the word Lucia used, most often, adaptable. Adaptability, she said, was more valuable than institutional knowledge. I wasn't bitter. I was observant. I watched her clear out anyone who reminded the company of where it came from. People who'd fixed things without fanfare, who knew systems in their bones rather than from a training manual. She didn't fire me first. She made me invisible. And when she finally told me I was no longer a fit for where the company was heading, I didn't argue. I simply nodded and began preparing for my exit. But I wasn't leaving empty-handed, because buried in those legacy systems she dismissed were not just lines of code. They were the quiet safeguards I had built, the ones that would quietly break without warning when the new blood took over and tried to plug a shiny dashboard into an old heartbeat. The day after my termination meeting, I arrived early. Earlier than usual, even for me. The building was still quiet, just the hum of the vending machines and the soft tick of motion lights coming on as I walked down the hall. I sat at my desk, my nameplate still there, though I doubted it would last the week. My inbox was already flooded with calendar invites for knowledge transfer sessions. Lucia wanted everything documented, mapped, and explained, preferably in a tidy PDF the consultants could skim between flights. So I gave them what they asked for. I spent Tuesday and Wednesday compiling 70 pages of comprehensive documentation. I outlined server hierarchies, access logs, database schemas, and authentication procedures. I described each module, its dependencies, and the locations of the config files, everything that was part of Neuroforge's official deployment infrastructure. It was clear, organized, and 100% accurate, but not 100% complete, because there were pieces of the system that were never part of any official build. Pieces that lived in the shadows of emergency fixes, scripts written at 2 a.m. during factory floor outages, API bridges I built after hours to appease legacy partners with non-standard protocols, fallback layers I'd installed during a cyber attack that no one even knew about because they worked too well to ever fail. Those systems weren't in version control, they were in my head. They were never meant to be permanent, but over time they had become the invisible arteries of the entire operation. So when I said I'd document everything official, I meant it. But I didn't touch the undocumented subsystems, not out of malice, but out of principle. If Lucia wanted a clean migration, she should have included the people who built the mess in the first place. On Thursday, I cleaned out my drawers photos of Eva and the kids, a metal coffee mug from the very first safety upgrade rollout, a folded letter from Don Agustin, handwritten in blue ink. Thank you for building the brain of this company. I left my badge at the front desk. As I walked out for the last time, no one stopped me. No goodbyes, no farewell cake, no one from the board. Just a quiet hallway and a soft ping from the elevator as it closed behind me. But I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was calm, like a man who had triple-checked the wiring before walking away from a bomb he didn't build but no longer had a reason to disarm. Because what they didn't understand, what they couldn't see buried inside all those systems, was that legacy code isn't just old. It's a warning label, and when you rip it out without reading it, you deserve what comes next. It started as these things often do with something small. Monday morning, 7th and 12 a.m., the line supervisor at our Reynosa facility reported that one of the robotic arms on Assembly Track 4 had frozen mid-operation. Then another glitch came in from Querétaro. An automated welder failed to execute its sequence, forcing a manual override. 30 minutes later, the system that managed inventory allocation in our Saltillo plant began assigning duplicate serial numbers. By 9 a.m., the internal alert dashboard was lit up like a Christmas tree. I was at home sipping black coffee, enjoying the first quiet morning I'd had in decades. I had promised myself I wouldn't check my work inbox, and technically, I didn't have one anymore. But when my phone rang and I saw the caller ID Santiago Landa, one of the junior engineers I had mentored for 6 years, I answered. Arturo, I know you're probably busy, but we have a problem. His voice was tense. I could hear the fatigue behind it. He wasn't calling as a formality. He was calling because something had gone very wrong. What kind of problem? I asked. The Core rollout went live this weekend. At first, everything looked fine, but today, none of the robotic systems are responding correctly, and the fallback protocol isn't kicking in. The diagnostic panel can't even see it. I paused. The fallback protocol. That was one of the systems I had built personally. It lived in a secured, isolated runtime, a safety net designed to silently activate whenever the main system failed. It was meant to be invisible unless you knew where to look, and clearly, no one had thought to look. Did you deploy the emergency bridge modules I left? I asked. What bridge modules? Of course, they weren't in the official handover. They were never in GitHub. They were handcrafted, tucked into sandbox environments, built with just-in-time patches whenever production crises flared up over the years. You might want to check the route management engine, I said. That's where the synchronization loop with the fallback protocol is initialized. We can't, he replied. Core replaced the engine with their AI-based traffic coordinator. It doesn't integrate with the legacy routines. I could already see it. The AI didn't recognize the old runtime. It thought it was garbage data and probably overwritten the hooks that kept it functional. Have you talked to Lucia? I asked. She's in meetings all morning with the board. We already lost a contract over the weekend with MyTech Assembly. Delays in their fulfillment pipeline. The consultants say it's a configuration issue, but he hesitated. Honestly, they don't know what they're looking at. Of course they didn't. Core was built for plug-and-play environments. It assumed a clean slate, not a company woven together over 30 years by custom processes, undocumented patches, and live production fixes made during storm blackouts or holiday emergencies. And now it was trying to run Neuroforge like a tech demo. What do you need from me? I asked. We're hoping you could walk the team through what's missing. At least give us a map. I looked out the window at the street below. The neighbor's dog was barking at nothing. The sun was crawling across the concrete, and for the first time in weeks, I felt no rush to go anywhere. I'm not with Neuroforge anymore, Santiago, I said calmly. If they want consulting help, they know how to reach me. He was silent for a long moment. Understood. We hung up. 5 minutes later, my inbox, still synced to my personal backup, pinged 13 times. By the end of the hour, I had 22 messages. Project leads, factory supervisors. One frantic email from a Xenocore tech labeled urgent in all caps. I read them all. Then I deleted every single one. Because they had made their choice. They chose dashboards over depth, speed over understanding. They thought replacing me would be clean. But what they didn't realize is that I wasn't just a part of the system. I was the system. And now they were discovering what happens when you remove the brain but expect the body to keep moving. By Tuesday morning, the headlines hadn't reached the media yet, but inside the industry, the collapse was spreading like wildfire. Neuroforge's operations were no longer disrupted. They were disintegrating. Entire shipments of precision-milled automotive components sat idle in warehouse lots, untagged and unprocessed. The synchronization protocol between their manufacturing AI and external logistics systems had failed. Worse, they didn't even realize how deeply it had failed until clients started calling. I heard about it not through formal channels but through friends, former colleagues, or people I had shared coffee with in the break room or helped troubleshoot at 2 a.m. back in the day. They called not to beg, but to warn. Hyundai Robotics, pulled out of the integration trial, said, Martine, a former operations lead, $3 million gone, just like that. Altitech suspended our certification, whispered Mariana from QA. They flagged inconsistencies in predictive tolerance reports, something about unreliable calibration logic. That calibration logic had once been my pride. A piece of software so accurate we once identified a faulty pressure valve before the vendor knew it had failed. Now it was buried under lines of AI code written by consultants who didn't know the difference between real-world variance and theoretical thresholds. Lucia, of course, went silent. No all-hands meetings, no statements. Just a flurry of internal tickets escalating in urgency until someone higher up noticed the bleeding. That someone turned out to be Enrique de la Mota, the chairman of the board. At 8:21 a.m., I received an email directly from his office, polite, urgent, asking for a private consultation regarding the technical challenges during the Xenocore migration. I replied with one line, consulting services available. Standard rate, $250, Artras, 60-hour minimum engagement. Payable in advance. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. It was not Enrique. It was Lucia. Her voice was colder than ever, stripped of confidence, now tight with frustration. Arturo, she began, skipping any greeting. This is not the time to posture. We are facing a full-scale production freeze. You mean the cloud-native transformation isn't going as planned, I said without hiding the irony. This is serious. I agree, I replied. So let's talk seriously. There was a pause. What do you want, she asked. Not gently, not diplomatically, just with the edge of someone used to control, now desperate to get it back. I want my time respected, I said. I want acknowledgement that experience matters. And I want you to stop pretending I was the problem when I was the one holding the seams together. Another pause. Longer this time. You're asking for a lot. No, I said, I'm offering a solution. The real question is, how much are you willing to lose before you accept that she hung up without another word? By Thursday, I was already in talks with Redline Automata, a lean but fast-growing industrial AI firm based in Guadalajara. Their CTO had reached out weeks earlier after news of my retirement hit his radar. Arturo, he had said, we don't need flashy. We need stable. You in, I was. Neuroforge, meanwhile, was trying to patch a broken framework with duct tape made of panic and bureaucracy. And all the while, their competitors' companies, I now advised, were quietly absorbing their frustrated clients. Because here's the truth no whiteboard strategist wants to admit. When you erase the architect, the building doesn't fall right away. But the cracks are instant, and once they spread, no AI can save you. It was Friday morning when the call came, not from Lucia, not from any consultant, and certainly not from the junior engineers still trapped inside the chaos. This one came from the top. Enrique de la Mota, chairman of the board of Neuroforge, called me directly. His voice was composed, but behind the calmness was a hint of something rarely heard from people at his level humility. "Senor Medina," he began, "I believe it's time we speak honestly." I let him continue. "We understand now that critical elements of the legacy infrastructure were not accounted for in the migration. Our operational teams are struggling to re-establish functionality, and several key clients are considering withdrawing their contracts." I waited in silence. "We need your help. Name your terms." It was the sentence Lucia should have spoken weeks ago, but she hadn't, and now the board had realized that what they once saw as technical debt was actually structural integrity. "I'll be direct," I said. "If I come back, it's under these conditions: full reinstatement as Chief Systems Architect, absolute authority over all technical decisions, immediate termination of the Zinocor contract, and Lucia Carranza's resignation." He didn't respond immediately. "That's, substantial," he finally said. "It's non-negotiable." "Arturo," he said, "we're already bleeding. If you could find it in yourself to..." I cut him off. "You don't need a patch. You need a reset. And I'm not coming back to clean up someone else's mess while they're still holding the mop." He was quiet for nearly 20 seconds. "I'll take your terms to the board," he said. "I can't promise anything." "You just did," I replied. "You called me." We ended the call politely, professionally, but I knew the tone had shifted. I wasn't just a forgotten technician anymore. I was leverage. I was the last card they had left to play. An hour later, I received another call, this time from Redline Automata's CTO. We had our second design meeting scheduled for Monday. A new system architecture built from the ground up, lean, elegant, and most importantly respected. That weekend, I received word through former colleagues that the board had met in an emergency session. Internal investigations had begun. Consultants were being reassigned. Lucia had not been seen on the executive floor since Wednesday. By Monday, a press release quietly announced a leadership restructuring initiative at Neuroforge. No names were mentioned, but I didn't need them to be. The final power shift had already happened. Because here's the truth: titles can be assigned. Offices can be redecorated. But real power, the kind that keeps the lights on the robots moving, the contracts honored, comes from understanding. And they had finally remembered who held that power all along. Not in a boardroom, but in the basement. I didn't return to Neuroforge. Not for the title, not for the paycheck, and certainly not for redemption. Because redemption implies guilt, and I had none. Instead, I walked into the clean, sunlit offices of Redline Automata that Monday morning with a notebook in hand and a head full of systems no whiteboard could replicate. The air smelled like fresh paint and ambition. Their development floor wasn't filled with ego, just quiet focus. Engineers actually asked questions before offering solutions. It was the kind of place that understood you build strong systems the way you build trust, layer by layer, with care and accountability. They didn't want a magician. They wanted a mentor. We didn't rush to launch a platform. We designed every module with documentation in mind. No backdoors, no undocumented patches. Every function traceable, every bridge logged. If a part failed in 5 years, someone would know exactly why. By the end of the first quarter, 2 of Redline's mid-tier competitors reached out for consultations. Not because of a flashy ad campaign, but because word had spread. Arturo Medina was building something solid again. Something you could rely on when it was 3 a.m. The server lights were flashing red, and production couldn't afford to stop. Meanwhile, Neuroforge's spiral continued. They issued a vague statement about leadership transition and strategic recalibration. But in the background, they hemorrhaged clients. High-tech precision galleon logistics and even MyTech assembly, all former pillars, quietly canceled or declined renewals. 6 months later, Neuroforge was acquired by Vector Nova Holdings, folded into an IP buyout deal that stripped them of their name, their contracts, and most of their staff. The company I once built from a dusty storage room was now a line item on a corporate ledger. But I didn't grieve. Instead, I spent my afternoons walking the Redline factory floor, answering questions from young developers who still believed in learning from the past instead of erasing it. One of them, just out of university, asked me why I never went back even when they begged. I smiled. Because some systems aren't meant to be rebooted, I said. They're meant to be replaced with something better. And that's exactly what we were building. Not just better tech, better values. This story isn't just about one man or one company. It's about a mindset that's quietly eating away at modern industries. In the rush to innovate, too many leaders forget that stability isn't old-fashioned. It's essential. That behind every working system, every flawless production line, or zero downtime launch, there's a person who made it work, not just a piece of software. Arturo Medina's story reminds us of something uncomfortable, but true. When companies trade wisdom for speed, they may win the quarter. But they lose the foundation. In today's world of artificial intelligence, cloud migrations, and automation at scale, it's tempting to believe that old knowledge is disposable. But real resilience, the kind that survives blackouts, crashes, and failed rollouts, comes from experience, from people, not platforms. If you've ever been overlooked because of your age, your quiet competence, or your refusal to speak in buzzwords, know this: your value doesn't expire. In fact, it becomes more rare and more powerful. If this story moved you or reminded you of someone you know, leave a comment below. Just type "still standing." That's all. And if you believe stories like this matter, consider subscribing. You'll hear more tales where truth, justice, and quiet revenge speak louder than corporate titles ever could.